Welcome to the panel on disasters and the rule of law. I am David Caron. I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the Dickson Poon School of Law at King's College in London. And so a few introductory comments. In the mid-1990s, I served as Director of Research with Charles Leben of, right down here at the Peace Palace, a summer research program on disasters. And so I thought I would prepare for that. It was disasters and the law, and I went around to various disciplines trying to collect what they knew about disasters. And we had a discussion earlier, and one comment we had, there's not a lot of academics generally in disasters, and there are not many in law either, and that's a whole discussion about why that is. But I finally reached economics, and I went up to a colleague who knew both law and economics, and I asked him what could his discipline tell me about disasters. And he replied, "That's easy." And I thought, oh my goodness, here comes an answer, finally. He said, "That's easy." He said, "That's a discontinuity. There's normal before and there's normal after." And what was really interesting was in that simple move, he kind of dismissed as a field of study the whole area, because it was more or less that, of course, you can't say anything about a discontinuity, because a discontinuity, a rip in the normal, is something you can't talk about. And I think there are two things that are really critical for us in that comment for today's discussion, if this area is at all new to you. First, disasters is for many of us a tragedy where an act of God creates this rip in the normal. And it causes a great deal of destruction, a great deal of human suffering. But what's crucial to see is that the breadth over time, the depth of that human suffering, is a choice that really we make. It is true that there is some act, some moment that rips, but what the consequences are, how it spreads out, is something that really involves us. And the second thing I would want to emphasize is that is a very empowering insight, and actually a very hopeful insight. So we start with a tragedy that is that we all are concerned with, the depth of suffering, but almost every action we can take will reduce that. And that's what's so important about this work. There's a book by Peter Bernstein called Against the Gods. I don't know if any of you have read this, but it's a book about the history of risk. And it doesn't talk about disasters anywhere, but he talks about gambling. And apparently centuries ago, no one had an idea of probability or odds, and they would gamble, and they had no sense whether one bet was better than another. It was just sort of just luck if you won or lost. But if you start to understand risk, then you start to make better bets. And similarly here, we make better actions that don't gain but reduce the amount of suffering we might have. So what does our topic today have to do with the rule of law, this big topic of disasters? And I would say it does, because what we're going to talk about are tools. Tools, actions, solutions you can think about taking home. And those tools are institutions, their governance. Rule of law is really buried in all of that. This is not, I don't think the solution, I think we're all in agreement, is not about hoping to have the best person in place at the time of the disaster to act. It's about having the institutions that get us the best persons before the disaster, during the disaster, after the disaster, informed, educated, all those things baking into the system good choices that reduce what's going to happen. What's the plan for the panel? First, we have an absolutely great panel. This is really amazing in my view. So on my far right is David Fisher of the International Committee on the Red Cross, an organization who makes it its business to be there first on the front line, disaster relief. On my immediate right is Satoru Nishikawa of the Japanese Water Agency. And he's devoted his efforts to reducing the vulnerability of populations to disasters, or what is often called disaster risk reduction. And then in the middle is Frank Neuner, who served as president of the State Bar of Louisiana at the time of Hurricane Katrina, and dealt firsthand with the need for a legal system to be there for a population that needed it in many, many ways. So the plan is I'm going to turn to each of them in turn to explore the particular emphasis they have and the rule of law. And on each one, we're going to try to have a dialogue and involve you through a few questions. So it'll be coming to you, back to the panel, to you, back to the panel. When you have a question, there are 2 microphones up front. So I'm going to ask that you use the microphone for the benefit of the audio recording. And so let me turn to David first. And David, just to introduce for a moment, when did you first join the International Committee for the Red Cross? What was your first, was it disasters from the outset? Which one were you involved with?
Just a small correction, because the Red Cross movement is over 150 years old. It's incredibly complicated. It's just the history has piled things on.
Okay.
And so we actually have there's actually two elements of the International Red Cross. There's an International Committee of the Red Cross, which is our sort of forming member of the movement. And they are well known as being the guardians of international humanitarian law. And they are very responsible for providing humanitarian assistance in situations of armed conflict. I work for the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Our headquarters is just down the road from the ICRC. And we are essentially the club, the global club of all the National Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And I'm sure you're familiar with them in your countries. There are 187 of them. They provide a whole host of services, but they're certainly very involved in disaster response, disaster preparedness, public health, community health type activities. They do first aid, they do social services, services for migrants, a collection of different things, blood work in a number of countries. But it's been known since the very beginning for humanitarian assistance. And in fact, one of the things that sort of helped to launch the movement was this idea of creating national societies to prepare in cases of wars. Our founders' idea was to have every country should have their own society, and whenever there's a war, they would go out and care for the wounded soldiers, because at the time no one was caring for them. But they soon discovered that you can't just wait for the next war. What is the society going to do? They're going to do disasters. And that turned out to be a good decision, because there are lots of disasters. Most of our societies spend most of their time working on disasters. And that work just keeps going up and up and up. Just over the last 2 decades, we've seen a doubling in the number of disasters worldwide, mostly weather-related, mostly due to the effects of climate change. And so this ranges from massive heat waves like they had here in Europe a couple of years ago, killing almost 15,000 people just in France alone, to storms and to floods, which is the most frequent disaster worldwide. So they've got quite a lot of work. Most of our members work at the community level through volunteers. But we in the Federation also do a lot of international relief activities in the major disasters, like the Pakistan floods of a couple of years ago, the Haiti earthquake, and these kinds of things. And so I think mostly what I would refer to as that experience of international relief.
Mm-hmm. So I think we use as examples these really large global disasters that we hear about in the press. Are you, at the same time, I suppose those disasters are ones that exceed local capacity to handle. Do you have a sense, or does the Federation watch disasters generally? I suppose societies are responding to smaller disasters within their countries.
Absolutely. Absolutely, we do. I mean, the vast majority of disasters never hit sort of global headlines. The vast majority of people who are affected, the vast majority of disasters that occur are what they call small disasters, where you may only have a couple hundred people who are killed. But for those people, and for anybody who's lost their homes, obviously this is not a small issue. And it's a real problem because it's actually causing a huge drag on the development of a lot of countries, but it doesn't really come up to consciousness. Whether that's a legal issue is another question. And we do have some programs where we try to provide funding for small-scale operations of our members through what we call the Disaster Response Emergency Fund. But when we actually get directly involved in operations, it's these major catastrophes, and we've seen a lot of them recently. In 2011, with these floods in Bangkok, affected 2 million people, millions of people affected in Pakistan, historic floods in Colombia just a couple of years ago, the earthquake in Haiti killed 250,000 people on one day. We have certainly seen our share in the last couple of years of these mega disasters.
Wait, so going to this question of rule of law and disaster response, how does law or rule of law come up in that? I mean, it would seem you're just transporting relief workers to Haiti or to Pakistan, trying to do what you want to do to relieve suffering. How does law come into this? Or is there not enough law, too much law? Whose law?
Well, this is a good question. I mean, we're fortunate to be working in an area where basically everybody is thinking along the same lines, right? There's a disaster. Usually in natural disasters, it's rare that you will have the kind of contest where a government will absolutely refuse outside assistance if they really need it. The one exception to that, more general exception, may be in situations of food security crisis, where governments are sometimes very hesitant to admit, essentially, that they have a famine going on in their country. It's also, in epidemics, governments can be very hesitant, with good reason, sometimes, about what kind of trade sort of impacts they'll have if they admit to such a thing. But in these sudden impact disasters, these floods, the earthquakes, generally speaking, they are open to outside assistance. But that doesn't mean that there aren't legal problems. And the program I work for started about 12 years ago, based on our own experience of just endless delays and restrictions and bureaucracy on our own work, and what we were finding more and more with our colleagues as well. We did a series of studies on this over a series of about 5-6 years to sort of look at what are the main operational problems in these major operations. And you can probably guess what they are just from, just because they're cross-border operations. So you want to get a person across a border. That means they have to have, in many cases, a visa. So how long is it going to take you to get that visa? If you come in, for instance, on a tourist visa or just with a visa waived, do you have to renew that and come out of the country? When the tsunami hit Indonesia, people had to renew their visas every month, and they had to fly in and out of the country over and over again in the middle of an operation to renew their visa. The same thing happened in Thailand in the same disaster. We've had a lot of situations in Latin America where they have a lot of protections based on sort of pressure from the US in terms of their immigration policies, where other countries have visa requirements to come in. There are issues with getting your goods and your equipment in the country. Is your flight going to be allowed to fly over the country or not? Especially if it's on a military flight. What kind of restrictions are there going to be? If you bring in your goods by ship and they are not cleared off the dock in time, what kind of, they call it demurrage fees. We've had to pay enormous amounts for demurrage, which is basically the price you pay for having it too long at the dock because the dock workers aren't there. We've had situations just recently, actually, in one country where we had stopped at one port on the way to another country, and we had to pay 60,000 Swiss francs worth of fees, storage fees there, while we're waiting to get it through customs clearance just for transfer. And we've seen in some disasters delays of up to sometimes months for goods to get through customs.
Are you having to figure this out every time? Is it
more or less?
Is it just, you know, I had to find out Thailand law this time and?
This is a good point. I mean, there are some international documents about this. There are a couple of global treaties. Very few people in our field have ever heard of them. I'm sure many of you have not heard of them either.
Few people in our field have heard of them.
That's right. And I think that there are quite a few regional agreements, and there are more and more all the time. States are increasingly interested in kind of organizing themselves around some of these issues regionally. And they're developing, operating procedures and mechanisms and ways to sort of to handle the confusion of offers and requests for assistance, which can also be very stressful. So, for instance, when they had the floods in Thailand, the government did not make an official request for outside assistance for whatever reason, and because of that, many governmental agencies were not able to respond. And UN agencies were not able to respond. They must have an official request. But a government may feel that it's a failure to make an official request, and so they say, well, welcome aid. On the other hand, Japan, after the recent sort of great East Japan earthquake, had 167 offers of assistance. And that's just from the governments. And there's, in the last couple of years, there's been an explosion in the number of different types of actors who may show up in a big mediatized disaster. Not just governments. It's UN agencies that weren't involved in disasters before. It's regional organizations. It's private companies. Lots and lots of non-governmental organizations.
So what can a country? What should a country be doing in advance?
What we really recommend that governments do is that they create their own procedures before the disaster strikes about how they're going to facilitate, on the one hand, customs clearance for medications, for food, for vehicles, for telecommunications equipment. They're all heavily regulated under national law. And if you don't have a system for dealing with them in a disaster, it's chaos. They need to have a focal point. They need to have a system for overseeing aid that's coming in. Because what our consultations found is it wasn't just that there were bottlenecks, but there were tremendous headaches that the humanitarian community causes by sending the wrong things into disasters. Sending things that are not needed, that are not appropriate. After the tsunami, they received Father Christmas costumes, they received drapery, they received high-heeled shoes. After Hurricane Mitch in Honduras, they received a shipment of 5,000 high-heeled shoes, just the left shoe. They received underwear, they received used clothes, they received pork in Indonesia. There's an amazing sort of overflowing will to help many times, but often it comes with, I have something, I'm sure they need it, and so we're going to send it. And it's communities that do this, it's sometimes governments. In Indonesia, after the tsunami, was pleading with foreign governments to stop sending us field hospitals. They said, look, tsunami struck, everybody who was going to die has died. We have our own medical system, please stop sending them. But they had so much pressure from the public back home. It was on the news, it was such a terrible disaster, this is what they had available, that's what they sent. And it's not just a waste of their time and money, it can actively block the right aid from getting through. So in Indonesia, sorry to harp on this so much, but we saw delays of sometimes up to a year for some relief consignments to get through customs. But on the other hand, they were dealing with literally trucks full of expired medications, or medications that were labeled in languages that nobody spoke, expired food, just items that were completely irrelevant. So governments really, it's in everybody's interest for them to be, on the one hand, ready to facilitate outside assistance, but also to keep an eye on it. It's not a good idea just to throw open the doors and let anybody who feels interested to show up.
It sounds like an amazing lack of international coordination. I mean, it's bilateral, chaotic.
There is an elaborate system of coordination that has been set up under the United Nations, but none of it is based on law. It's based on soft law. It's based on resolutions and and codes and guidelines. And there's been a real hesitation from states to put authority in any one body. So even though there's an agency at the UN that's really the main one for coordination, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, in the UN, it does not have authority over any other UN agency, much less another government or a private actor or an NGO. And so they have guidelines, they have set up a system of humanitarian clusters, so we have sectoral coordination, we have many sort of meetings and systems at the horizontal level, but that doesn't interact directly with the law of the affected state. And that is where we think the most progress could be made, because most governments essentially have no rules on this.
Can I just ask, so on this assistance coming in, would you say that most of it is coming from states, or what proportion is coming just privately in a way that's just below the radar? So it's an NGO, or it's a religious charity, something just coming in, they just arrive on a tourist visa, or?
The vast majority of the money that's recorded, that's provided in humanitarian assistance, is coming from governments. But most of it is channeled through UN agencies and NGOs and Red Cross. Mm-hmm. There is an increasing amount of private donations also going for international disasters, particularly the tsunami, but also after the Japan earthquake. And they make up an increasing amount. It's still dominated by governments and dominated just by a few, and certainly the US is the biggest among them, with ECHO being number 2 in terms of donors. There are some new donors that are also coming up, particularly in the Middle East and among the BRIC countries, but they don't always go through the same system, so a lot of their donations are not recorded at a national level.
Yeah. Let me ask Frank and Satoru, do you have anything to add from your national experiences? I had the impression, Frank, in Katrina, that there were offers from abroad, but I don't know if it's the U.S. is not used to it or prideful, but it was a slow response.
Yeah, there was definitely a slow response by both state and local government. State government was afraid to ask local government to come in and, quote, take over, which is probably what should have happened, because state government wasn't equipped to handle the crisis. And then the federal government, I think, similar to the government of Thailand, was probably embarrassed that we couldn't handle our own crisis, so they were slow to accept aid from other governments. Although eventually a good bit of aid did come to the New Orleans area from foreign governments, particularly Saudi Arabia, made a large donation. From the Bar Association standpoint, we received a lot of contributions from other bars and from lawyers around the country. And we were soliciting help, so I wasn't proud about not being prepared. But there seems to be, this belief by politicians that asking for help shows weakness or shows that they weren't prepared, and they lose sight of the people that need the help, and it becomes a political game.
So one story you can bring home, this is an academic paper I heard, so I'm going to put it to that category, but the present president of Myanmar, who's led the opening of that country, was at the time of their disaster some time ago the general that let the aid in. They resisted aid, but he sort of internally became the one that was known, the one that somehow thought about people over their policy.
Yeah, I think when you look at Katrina, one of the heroes was General Honore, who's from Louisiana, but he was a general in the Army who was assigned to come home and oversee the recovery. And why was he successful? One, he knew the culture, but I think principally because he was a general, he was used to making decisions, And that seemed to be the biggest problem after Katrina, was just making a decision, and moving forward with it. And if you're in the military, which I've never been, but I know they're used to making decisions and following rank. Funny story, we were receiving contributions and money, so the Bar Association has money to give away. Well, typically the bar is always looking for money, so this was a new phenomena for us. So we're sitting around a conference room table in Baton Rouge, and former bar president, friend of mine, has agreed to chair this committee, and we're debating, much like our disaster group today, working group was debating, and everybody's making good points, but we're not making any progress. And he raised his hand and said, whoa. He said, I have a 2 o'clock appointment, and let's get this straight. This is a disaster. As long as 60% of our decisions are correct, we're moving forward, not backwards. So we can't have perfection here. And I think that's one of the biggest things with regard to the response part of the disaster, is just be decisive and make decisions and move forward.
Satoru, you want to add to the response?
Well, I have been personally involved in Japanese disaster management response since 1989. And back in 1991, there was a major volcanic eruption and a pyroclastic flow. Pyroclastic flow is something which happened in Vesuvius, which destroyed the Pompeii, and that similar things happened in Japan. And well, in Japan we have a lot of disasters: volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons that's similar to hurricanes, and we have floods and snow avalanches. So we have a long history of dealing with various types of disasters, and we have learned lessons. And also, I have worked in the UN. David had mentioned about the UN coordination, and I was a UN Senior Relief Coordination Officer for 3 years. And I have dealt with so many large-scale and mid-sized natural disasters, and mostly in developing countries. And I would say that there are very funny phenomena. I would say there are popular disasters in the international media, unpopular disasters. The most popular disaster is an earthquake in a city. It makes the TV screens, headlines. But in case of middle-sized floods or landslides in a not famous country, it's not popular. It means that no international assistance would automatically flow. And this is the irony. But the sufferings of the people is the same, be it a very headline news or a not headline news, the suffering is there. And how to reduce these sufferings is the topic. And having dealt with so many international relief assistance, if you are sensible, you will find that you have to cut this kind of a vicious cycle. Because in some developing countries, they have very few resources to control disasters. So what happens, they are repeatedly hit by various natural disasters. It means that the level of conditions of the normal people would degrade because of the disaster, and it leads to usually land degradation. So this turns into a vicious cycle. And the more the land is deteriorating, you have floods and desertification. And we have seen such examples. Now, having seen these examples, we have to think and change the vicious cycle. We have to try to reduce the disasters. And that's what I have been addressing for the 20 years. And I have been personally involved in the international negotiations at the 2005 UN World Conference on Disaster Reduction, which was held 3 weeks after.
We're going to turn to disaster reduction in 1 second.
Yeah.
And we're going to hold that thought.
Okay.
2005. Let me just ask one question, because it is so stunning, this fortuity of news coverage, right? If you have news coverage, you may be better off. And there's a sense in which rule of law is about situations are treated equally. It's not just the luck. And so I guess I would just throw out, would greater international frameworks and need more funding, because partly the coverage is bringing funding, but would it at least mean that everyone's focusing equally? It's about humanitarian relief, it's not about satisfying the news. Would it help, David?
Well, I can say there was an attempt in the time of the League of Nations to create a single disaster agency. And in fact, there was a treaty that was developed, it was adopted during the League of Nations and had some 37 parties, and it created the International Relief Union. And the theory was this union would be in charge of all international disaster response. Governments were going to send all their money to this agency. And in fact, the Red Cross was going to be the sort of secretariat. That was the arrangement. And what happened was the states never sent any money to this agency. It just folded. It was involved in 3 disasters, and then it ran out of money, and that was it. And it died even before the League of Nations died, because they want to show their solidarity, and they want to show it on TV. Their flag shows, like, we were there with your tax money, being effective, helping these poor people, not, oh, we put our money into somebody else's agency. And so that's
an interesting lesson.
That's a difficult part. There has been more recently a sort of somewhat of an example of this. There's a treaty called the Food Assistance Convention. It used to be the Food Aid Convention, and it set a minimum amount of food aid that every signatory government agreed to give every year somewhere around the world. They've just changed it so that now it used to be it was in the text of the treaty how much they were going to give, which is obviously not very flexible. So now they just announce every year as sort of a transparency measure, like this is how much we're going to give. But donors have been very reluctant to lock themselves in otherwise to a certain amount of assistance.
Interesting. Let me just, before we go to risk reduction on disasters, do people have some questions they want to bring in here? So we'll bring Jessica and then the woman behind her, and if you could use the mic, Jessica. Then you can bring it back with you, so the mic's sort of in the middle there.
I guess my question, I think, is for David. It sounded as if the countries are continually taken by surprise, even though we don't know what disasters they're going to be, but there's always going to be disasters. And I wonder, does the ICRC or the Federation provide kind of advisory assistance to help countries and to identify the weaknesses of their legal frameworks and say, what you really need is you need a national disaster organization and you need this type of legislation and this will help you, so that they have the frameworks in place when a disaster comes?
Please.
Yes, we do. We in 2006 we helped to negotiate a set of guidelines. It's called the Guidelines for the Domestic Facilitation and Regulation of International Disaster Relief, and it's basically recommendations based on what our research showed was missing from a lot of existing national laws, based on this experience, both on the side of facilitating, sort of not having the bureaucracy, and on oversight, or having some kind of standards for that relief of quality. And that was adopted by the state parties to Geneva Conventions in 2007. And since then, we've been working in about 30 countries to provide technical assistance like this. 12 countries so far have adopted a new law or new procedure. There are about a dozen that are pending, but it's too slow. It's too slow, and we'd really like to see a lot more attention to this. It's not expensive just to put this kind of procedure in place, but many countries, like the US, for instance, didn't expect, even though they're one of the world's most disaster-prone countries, we'll never seek outside assistance, and so we don't need to have any rules. After the Katrina experience, now they have there's an interagency framework in the U.S. for dealing for government-to-government assistance, but they still have no rules for dealing with non-governmental assistance. So there's some progress, and we're seeing now some governments that are starting to move along these lines.
The next question. Well, yeah.
Just one question and some comments. Is there a definition of disaster in any law? Because coming from ASEAN, we do have the ASEAN Agreement for Disaster Management, and there is a definition. And also, let me just tell you some of the trends that ASEAN has faced, as you know, arising from Cyclone Nargis and Philippines and in Thailand. But first on Cyclone Nargis. One of the problems of Cyclone Nargis, as you know, was that first they refused because they didn't want military aid from outside of ASEAN, and it took, in fact, Surin Pitsuwan, at that time he was the Secretary General, to negotiate with the president then, and the doors were open. It was a bit late, but anyway, ASEAN went in. One of the problems was that the question of sovereignty, and this has always been an obstacle in ASEAN countries, and I think there is a lot of misunderstanding about the Westphalian concept of sovereignty. Right now, Indonesia too, they say don't interfere with our domestic affairs. So there's this doctrinal obstacle among developing countries, and very much so in ASEAN. Having said that, after Cyclone Nargis, and then very soon after that, there was the flood. In fact, Cyclone Nargis is a very, very good case study. And there is a case study, Samana, is from the top government, the whole of the ASEAN approach, or whole of the world approach. This is, in fact, now the trend. And in fact, ASEAN has signed an MOU, both with the World Bank as well as United Nations. And there was a lot of talk that in disasters like Katrina, no one country, no one regional organization can really deal with the situation. And so the approach should be the whole of the world approach. So I wonder whether there is a trend or whether there should not be pressure brought to bear upon the United Nations to have a whole of the world approach with regional organizations. You can sign MOU. And you mentioned about hard law and soft law. And here I think it doesn't matter whether it's soft law or hard law, because in the environmental context, soft laws play a very important role. So first, I want to know from in fact, the Red Cross, and after that, in fact, in the ASEAN countries in 2001 at the Bali Summit, following from the framework of the ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management, which provides for a humanitarian center to be set up. And very recently, only 2012, that now there is a humanitarian center being set up, because you must consider not only during the disaster, but the post-disaster. And now I think from our Japanese friend, he's talking about the pre, during, post. So it's a whole cradle-to-cradle type of approach. And I would really like to see Red Cross, in fact, Red Cross is now very much in the forefront, to collaborate with UN and with all the other regional organizations. What do you think of this trend? Do you see it coming?
Okay, well, so thank you for raising this. I mean, the ASEAN agreement was it's a really good example. It was negotiated in a flash. I mean, it really just was put together in just a period of basically 1 year, that agreement after the tsunami. And as you say, it was the political part that was able to open up the logjam that had happened in Nargis. Although it was very clear that the government was not following the letter of that very important agreement, because they were at that point not letting outside assistance in. And the ASEAN agreement is unusual in many ways, one of them being that it doesn't just deal with regional assistance from within the region, but it deals more generally. And it includes non-governmental assistance, which they say is a major channel for a lot of the aid that comes in. Most of the existing treaties about disaster response completely ignores the Red Cross, or ignores NGOs, ignores even the UN. ASEAN does not. And the other thing to point out with about this ASEAN agreement is that even before it went into force, ASEAN was arranging simulations and exercises and meetings, and it was having a really positive impact, and it still does. And the new AHA Center, I think, is going to be a really positive force as well. The only caveat to all of this is that there's a lot of regions are doing something similar. Central America and the Caribbean, in the Pacific, certainly in Europe, and also in various sort of sub-regional organizations in Africa. They're creating their own systems, and some of them are recreating systems that exist at the global level. For instance, a lot of them want to be the filter by which offers and requests of assistance will come in, because governments get overwhelmed, too many requests, how are they going to deal with all this, so we'll help to filter this. But now we have lots of them. So OCHA is supposed to do this at the UN level, ASEAN wants to do it, NATO wants to do it even when they're in that country, the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, the same thing. There's a potential here for some atomization at the regional level. And so I think your point that you make about having a whole world approach, recognizing the critical sort of value added that these regional mechanisms really do have, but stitching them together. Because not all of the aid, even though you hope most of the aid will come from nearby, some of it is going to come, at least be offered from outside. So somehow they also have to be part of a system. I'm happy to talk more later about the Red Cross and Red Crescent and risk reduction, because it definitely concerns us quite a bit.
So let me just drop one note in. The focus of the comments so far have been on the receiving country, on the legal issues about filtering, about who's coming in. So I serve on an advisory committee at the State Department, and one topic that came up was a legal person was in the room from state, and the question was, every disaster, the same questions comes up, where the U.S. is sending aid out, and they were trying to get their own sort of, let's not think of it every time, we can think this through in advance. But then an interesting twist that fits our rule of law discussion is, that has not been raised, is the question of immunity once you send someone in to help. I mean, are they somehow going to be responsible for what's going to happen, which can slow down entry if you start discussing that. And the point made was that much of it is under-lawyered, and it may be better that it's under-lawyered, that the step up to really get the type of a lawyerly agreement you'd want about entering a country, you just don't have time to do. So normally they just go ahead and enter without the assurances that some advisor might want.
We had that experience just within the states post-Katrina, where medical providers, lawyers wanted to come in to Louisiana, and we wouldn't give them immunity. We proposed it, but there was a segment of the bar that said, no, we can't give them immunity, other than just the Good Samaritan immediate immunity, where somebody's in dire need, but to come in and treat either legally or medically, the state would not grant immunity. And I can imagine that's a system. I'm not aware of anyone being sued for malpractice legally or medically after that. So I think that's probably a better soft solution, approach.
So why don't we hold the question? You can come in after the next segment. I want to make sure we head into this one I held Satoru back from, because it's a giant one. So we're transitioning to risk reduction. We're not reducing the risk of an earthquake. What are we reducing the risk of?
Well, we cannot stop earthquakes. Right now, we cannot stop typhoons. But the earthquake itself is not a disaster. It's just an abnormal natural phenomenon. But if an earthquake hits a very vulnerable city, it turns into a disaster. And so the disaster is a combination of the natural phenomena and the societal conditions. By improving the societal conditions, we can reduce the disasters. And this has been the Japanese history regarding typhoons. In the 1940s and 50s, every time a typhoon hit Japan, we usually lost about 1,000 people every time a typhoon came. In 1959, there was a major typhoon hit the city of Nagoya, the third largest city in Japan, and we lost 5,000 people. And the Japanese government said, this is enough. We have to change our mindset. So what we did was, first, you know that we have Mount Fuji, the highest mountain in Japan. It's beautiful. It's the highest peak in Japan, and the Japanese traditionally worshipped it as a god. But at that time, after the 1959 typhoon, the Japanese Meteorological Agency made a good argument. Let's put a meteorological radar on top of Mount Fuji. And by having the meteorological radar, it covers a wide area, and there would be better typhoon tracking. And this really improves the weather forecast in Japan. And by that, but not just by that mounting of the radar, we have combined flood controls, dams, dikes, river controls, and the warning system with the meteorological agency. And really this helped to really decrease the casualties by typhoons. Every year, the number of typhoons hitting Japan has not changed in the last 50 years. We usually have 2 or 3. But nowadays, a typhoon hits Japan. If we are not lucky, we lose about maybe 50 to 100 lives. But it's not anymore thousands. The same thing happened to Bangladesh. In the 1970s, whenever a major cyclone hit Bangladesh, they lost hundreds of thousands of people in one cyclone. And they said this is enough. And with the advice from the Red Crescent, they have established a cyclone warning system. And it's a combination of the cyclone forecast and the local community leaders running on a bicycle with megaphones, alerting the fellow villagers to run up to a cyclone shelter. And at least they can save lives. So we have had successes of reducing risk. The material damage cannot be really prevented, but at least we can save lives. And we have had so many of these success stories. And by having the lessons learned, let's try to change it into a more of a institutionalized approach. And that, I think, is the role of the law. Now, in Japan, we, as a disaster management officer in Japan, I had been taught a number 3 is important for your response. Let me tell you. The most dreadful thing for Japan is earthquake, because we cannot really predict an earthquake beforehand. Now we have something called a real-time earthquake warning system. It gives the warning of a major earthquake maybe 5 seconds or 15 seconds before the main shake, but it's too short. But what we are trained is that if there's an earthquake, first 3 minutes, you have to protect yourself. Then the first 30 minutes, you have to make communications to your partners immediately, because after 30 minutes, all the telephone lines will be jammed and stopped. In 3 hours, we are supposed to dispatch the initial search and rescue. The initial responding, the failure and the success of the initial response depends on the first 3 hours for life savings. Then 3 days, that's the real search and rescue phase. And in 3 weeks, we have to change it into a relief, reconstruction, rehabilitation mode. And also in 3 weeks, what would happen? The mass media would forget. And that's the most difficult thing. Now, I guess in any country, when there's a major disaster, all the politicians, all the mass media would be so excited, and they would shout that there has to be disaster risk reduction. But how long would that voice prolong? Maybe 3 weeks or 3 months maximum. And that's the reality. And the rule of law is important, I would say, because having this excitement to be institutionalized into an organized action to be sustained for years, that would lead to a substantial disaster risk reduction. And some countries have succeeded in putting these mechanisms in place. I have personally provided technical advice to some Asian countries which were hit by the Indian Ocean tsunami. For example, Indonesia, or Sri Lanka, or Thailand. And some of these countries have been successful in legislating their basic laws regarding disaster countermeasures. So that's the part that I see the important link of disaster risk reduction with the rule of law. Yeah.
Do you find, from what you're saying, you should be able to compare countries that are exposed to similar risks
Yeah.
and see some countries more successful than others? I mean, in actual, how much property damage, how much human loss of life? Can you do that? Is
Well,
that possible?
Yes, it is. And now there are several attempts to really gather statistics on damage and try to have a comparative analysis. But what is more important is to have, I'll say, a mutual learning process among the countries who have similar disasters. And we have initiated such mechanisms in the past 20 years. For example, I was once an executive director of the Asian Disaster Reduction Center, which was set up in 1998. And the main focus is to have an exchange of knowledge and experience amongst disaster management administrators in Asian countries, so that they can learn from each other what would be the bottlenecks of administrative procedure, what is the challenge of mobilizing resources for disaster risk reduction. And this has been working, and it has proven to be quite effective. Yeah.
You were mentioning that sort of the will for risk reduction decreases as you move away from the disaster. And so if you're viewing risk reduction as a little bit of a luxury for a country to do, so do you find that the rich countries do this more, do it relatively rich to those who have other priorities?
I would say it's not a matter of rich or not rich.
Yeah.
It's a matter of the politicians' observance or acceptance of the risk. Yeah. Because, for example, let's take the case of Indonesia.
The politicians are not all short-sighted?
For example, let's take the example of Indonesia.
Yes.
When President Yudhoyono came into office, 6 months after he assumed the position of the president, he was hit by the Indian Ocean tsunami. And he was so clever to find this as an important challenge for him. And now he has really taken the leadership in establishing a specific organization in his government to deal with risk reduction. So it really depends on how the political leaders accept the risk.
Frank, do you have a...
Yeah, I agree with Satoru, but in the other part of risk reduction is preparedness and a COOP plan, or continuing operation plan. And we learned firsthand how not having one was detrimental to our response and our recovery. And as a result, now all agencies of state government, all NGOs, the Bar Association, we encourage individuals to each have a COOP plan. But we were so ill prepared for Katrina that I had a meeting at the Ritz-Carlton in New Orleans the Saturday before Katrina, a board meeting. We cut it short to evacuate, and we just packed our suitcase and left the Bar Association thinking it'll be there when we need it to come back. And we didn't even have a key to the office that we could find when I was able to get state police escort to go back in to retrieve servers and to try and set up an office back in my hometown of Lafayette. We couldn't get in the office because we didn't have a key, and we didn't want to break the door down because there was looting in New Orleans. We didn't want open access. So that's how ill prepared that we were. And I think as part of the risk reduction plan, we talked about this earlier with Satoru, is being prepared to respond initially. And as he said, 3 minutes, 3 hours, and the quicker you can respond and make those decisions. Communication was another issue. I learned to text message after Katrina because the cell phones didn't work and the landlines didn't work because they were overloaded. Even in my hometown, which was not directly impacted, but what impacted us was our population increased over 50%, and so basic services couldn't support it. So, one of the most important things after a disaster is communication, and how do you communicate with not only family, friends, colleagues, but in my case, we needed to communicate with judges and the district attorney and public defenders, and they were scattered. We had at that point, no means of doing so. So, I think the preparation includes not only risk reduction now, which in New Orleans now better levees, floodgates, better pumps, but also this COOP plan for continuity. So.
You have to plan to be less vulnerable, you have to plan to respond, and you have to plan to somehow recover. All those. David? Do you want?
Maybe just bring out some of from our view, some of the legal gaps here. When we first started looking at this, our members in the Red Cross around 2003, they adopted this resolution saying we really want to start paying a lot more attention, because traditionally we have been the sort of, the buckets brigade. We show up after the disaster. They said we really want to move towards prevention. What can we do? We do a lot of education, we plant mangroves, we do advocacy. And on the legal side, we found that there's very little comparative work that's been done about legislation and risk reduction. There's lots and lots of work that's been done internationally comparing general systems and approaches, but not the legislation part. And we're involved in a study right now with UNDP looking at 26 countries. And what we're finding so far is that in a lot of countries, a number of countries have changed their National Disaster Management Act to call it something like a National Disaster Risk Management Act. They use the word risk now, but it hasn't changed very much fundamentally in how they do things. And what they have done is they've sent responsibility, if it wasn't already there, they send it down to the lowest possible level, usually to mayors, or even lower down in the government chain. And these people do not have the resources in many countries to do anything, much less to be thinking creatively about how to deal with increasing risks, changing risks over time due to climate change. There is a massive crisis worldwide of a lack of implementation of very simple rules like building codes, land use rules, that could keep people alive in a lot of these disasters, but no one does anything about it. And this is a problem. A lot of countries have the rules, but they just don't implement them. And we see increasingly there's this move towards urbanization, particularly in poorer countries. Africa is the most rapidly urbanizing continent in the world. We already have 1 billion people living in what they call informal settlements worldwide, according to the UN, and they think that will probably be 1.5 billion in just a couple of years. And these people are living in the most dangerous parts of the city, and they're living in the most dangerous possible constructions without any kind of service, with no legal status, of course, because it's illegal in the first place. So they have no education, there's no room to get to them in case there's a disaster, they have frequent fires, and they are absolutely death traps in the case of many of these types of disasters, particularly earthquakes, but also floods. And there are very few initiatives to deal with this. They live off the legal grid, and so they don't follow the rules, but they're also not benefited by the rules. They don't get education, they're not necessarily involved in decision making about risk reduction because there's no rule that requires it, in part. And the spending is not there. For the same reason, as Satoru was mentioning, the political will kind of vanishes over time as the new issue comes up. And so when the budget comes up next year, the year after, and the year after that, it just gets knocked off. And say, well, why do we have to spend on that event that hasn't even happened? In some countries, they're starting to experiment with putting budget line items, required budget line items for risk reduction. So the Philippines did this recently in their act. The 2005 act in India did this. Costa Rica did this. Required amounts of money that in every budget they're going to put towards being ready for the next one. And we think this is something that law could do. Last point on this, there's a real diffuse...
Can I just ask, but something like enforcing building codes, that's not, it might be more inspectors. Is that what you mean, or is it that the inspectors are not encouraged to do their job, or does it just vary everywhere?
Well, obviously it's different in different places, but there's a capacity issue because they're just not funded to do the kinds of inspection they need to do. Sometimes there are rule gaps. So in Nigeria, for instance, in the main cities, they have rules, and in the others, they don't apply, and outside of the main cities. But the major issue is that they're just not performing, and there's an attitude actually among many sort of disaster management experts that, oh, these countries, they're never going to implement these things anyway. They have too many political things on their plate. We'll just throw up our hands and we'll train masons to build better houses, which is important, but it's also letting governments off the hook a bit. And really, they should be helping us to be safer, and they can do this in many cases without that much problem. And the last point I was going to make is just that there's a real diffuse accountability for risk reduction in a lot of countries, because so many different sectors are involved, different layers of government, that in the end, nobody's responsible. And when no one is responsible, often things don't get done.
We were speaking earlier about rule of law, and to the extent that enforcement of the laws you can view as a central part of rule of the law, perhaps somehow that could be put into the rule of law index, particularly on building codes. Maybe we could take a couple questions on risk reduction. Yes, and the mic is up here. They're both in the front. Thank you.
Exercise. Thank you. Not necessarily just on risk reduction, but following from the previous discussion as well. One is, what are the, Mr. Fisher mentioned the difficulty in the immediate course of responding to a disaster of getting approval for the entry of certain kinds of products, goods, et cetera. In terms of the recommendations that your organization has developed, what are the best practices in terms of triggers? Is it congressional action, the executive action in terms of making the decision about declaring something a disaster and allowing aid to come in? Also, Mr. Neuner, I hope I pronounced that correctly, mentioned the challenge of establishing leadership and coordination mechanisms. What are the best practices there? You can get lucky and have a good general who comes in, who knows the territory, but are there less idiosyncratic ways of dealing with that? And then in terms of prevention, Mr. Nishikawa mentioned the need for being prepared and planning. What kind of training, simulations, other kinds of efforts are needed in preparation for disaster? And are they the same kinds of trainings that you might put in place for everyday disasters like fires and other kinds of emergencies? And then lastly, just because it's such a fascinating panel, if each of you could comment on what you have found to be the best sources of information on this topic, on disaster and disaster management, particularly for data. Thank you.
Maybe I should.
So why don't we start with Satoru? We'll work across.
Regarding the, I would say, training for preparedness. Well, for example, in the case of Japan, every year on the 1st of September, we have a nationwide disaster exercise. And the most important point is that we always have the Prime Minister to participate in this disaster. And that is most important because the Prime Minister or the President, they have so many kinds of topics to deal with. But at least once a year, to have in the side of their brains a bit of a sense about disasters. That's most important. And also, we are trying to mobilize also all the governors of the prefectures and all the mayors of the prefectures, the cities. And we are trying to, I would say, threaten them that if you fail in a disaster, you are going to lose your job. But not all the mayors participate, I must confess. But some mayors who are very sensible, they do participate. Some others don't, and they usually fail. And that's the irony. But at least to have the Prime Minister to always participate on the 1st of September exercise, and this has been accumulating for now 30 years. So if in case a future Prime Minister does not participate in that exercise, the mass media would immediately attack on them. And that's a kind of a mechanism to put the disaster risk or the disaster preparedness agenda on one of the national priority items at least once a year. So that's an example that can be followed. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Right.
I think leadership is it's a difficult challenge to, when you elect your governor or your mayor, you think you're picking somebody to lead. But are they really the person to lead in a disaster? And I think in Louisiana, our governor at the time was not a leader, and anybody that watched national news and saw her interviewed, you could see that in her. She was a very intelligent, thoughtful woman, but she just wasn't a leader. Contrast her with Admiral Landrieu, who was in charge of the Coast Guard after the BP spill most recently, and she was very decisive and was lauded for her decisiveness. So it's not a gender thing by any means, but the Admiral was used to making decisions, and she made decisions. Friends of mine said that I would not have been a successful bar president in a normal year because I make decisions and I'm decisive, and so we had a good response because we jumped into action and made these decisions. But in a more mundane year, maybe I wouldn't have been, as highly thought of as I was because of the hurricane and the response that the Bar Association had. So the leadership issue, I think the best way to compensate for that and the vagaries of leadership is just what Satoru said, and that's preparation and planning. And not only having a coup plan, but since the Katrina days, I've participated in a mock pandemic exercise. It was co-sponsored by the American Bar Association and FEMA and others in Washington. And just going through those exercises will teach us to all be better leaders, or at least to get out of the way so that the leader can take charge. But that's a difficult situation. You can look at Governor Christie after the superstorm Sandy. He was lauded for his leadership, and he made it bipartisan, which is, I think, what a good leader does. I think that was one of the faults of our governor at the time. She was so worried about appearing weak compared to President Bush that she wouldn't invite the federal government in. Well, that's not what a good leader uses all the resources available to him or her to solve the issue. So, but I think the preparation and planning, as Satoru, is the best way to ensure that you'll have the right leaders in place to respond to a disaster. So.
David, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, actually, maybe just on this last point, there's in a lot of systems currently, they put a lot of weight on the technical people. And they are the ones who do the exercises, in most countries, unlike in Japan, right? And so they are the ones who are ready. But then when the major disaster hits, it's the leaders that want to be involved. And if the system can't accommodate them, they'll push everything else aside and take over, and sometimes with equally disastrous results. So this is just one thing to think about, is to keep that, keep a role for the leadership and not just the technical people in your system. And just coming to the last question about the trigger and whether it should be a declaration of disaster. And I think this also relates, to the question I didn't address earlier about the definition of disaster. Every country has different definitions. A lot of international instruments also have varying definitions. And it depends on what the consequences of that declaration are. In the US, you can have a declaration of disaster basically every other week, because under the agricultural bill, they're constantly declaring disasters. In a lot of other countries, though, when you declare an emergency or a disaster, it's under your constitution, and it's exactly the same act you would take if there were a nationwide insurrection. And so it allows you to set aside all civil rights. It allows you to set aside the powers of a lot of lower level governments, and this can be politically and legally very stressful. And so governments are often hesitant to do it, even in a major disaster, because of the other these other consequences. So this is why we've seen in a lot of countries, for instance, that they don't request assistance because they can't until they've declared the emergency, which they don't want to declare, and so they just welcome assistance. We're not asking, but if anyone shows up, that would be okay with us, right? But we do think from our side, what we've recommended is that states should have a system where that they make an assessment whether they need the assistance first, and then that they make a request for it outside. They seek it. And in some places that might be very appropriately linked to a declaration of disaster, and other places maybe not. By the way, I have copies of these guidelines if anyone is interested to look at them.
So the one thing I would add, having earlier in my life I was in the Coast Guard and I wrote contingency plans, not continuing operation plans, but contingency plans. And the key in that type of discussion was you can't have fortuity about who the leader is at your time. So you're building in who's going to be, as soon as the declaration is made, this person is in charge, and that person would resist. Yes, go talk to the press, but all decisions are here, and there'll be consequences if you remove me. And that's the one person that trains and is ready, thinks about the mock, the running it through. But to rely on chance is pretty risky. There was one question there just before we go to, I want to make sure we have time here for Frank, but there was one question about where would you look for information? People go home. Is there some, within the UN, is there or within, where would you look for risk reduction guidelines, for example?
There's a small secretariat in the UN called the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction. And there is a specific website called the Prevention Web. And they have a lot of information there. Of course, the Red Cross has a lot of information. But if you go to the Prevention Web, you will find so many links to various sources of information. Right. And I must say that there are existing knowledge. There are a lot of the information. But how to mobilize it, how to utilize it is the challenge.
Yeah. It was interesting, after Katrina, we needed a manual to teach lawyers how to advise the public in disaster recovery, FEMA claims, and what to do, insurance claims. And so where did we find one of the best manuals was on Morrison and Foster, a big national law firm in the States, had on their website, they had a disaster recovery manual. The Florida Bar Association had a disaster recovery manual. So we took those two and created our own. If you now go to the Louisiana State Bar website, there's a disaster recovery manual. FEMA.gov is a wealth of information about not only business continuity, but individual continuity, what you should do with your family, so there's a lot of information now on the net that's accessible in the States and internationally that can help you. Great.
Well, David, Frank, you've opened up the line of questions I want to go to. You mentioned, there was this successful operation by the State Bar. You just described part of it. We're moving from trying to respond, which is the classical image we have, people showing up the day of the earthquake. We move from that to the idea that, we could have made this whole area safer and we wouldn't have had all the deaths and all the difficulty we've had. But once you're past those two steps, we're into a long recovery. And a lot of people who not only need doctors, but they need now to tie into the larger system through their lawyers, through probably other professional advice. And I'm just wondering, what was your experience?
Well, we got a lot of assistance from other bars that came in and gave us some advice. Texas Bar sent 5 staff people over for almost a week. One of the things they told me about, which I'd never thought of, they said you need to set up a hotline, a call center for people. So we set up a call center. We didn't have any funding. We said we'll find the funding, which we eventually did. It was close to $500,000 was the cost, but it was fully funded. It received over 20,000 calls, and the other thing about disaster is—
Did you advertise that number?
We advertised all the FEMA centers that we had, these emergency centers. They all had the number, and it was on the State Bar website. And if you call, all our members knew, so they would tell people you can call this free number. And what we made it a win-win for us as State Bar. We set it up at a law school. We paid law students to man it. They got experience. We got the benefit of relatively inexpensive labor. And we created an opportunity not only for that call center at the time to respond to the citizens, but that call center is still in existence today, and it's become the central intake for all the legal service providers in Louisiana, which we have for political reasons, 4 different legal service providers. So it's brought some continuity to the provision of services. That's the other thing that the takeaway for me from the Katrina experience was it created a lot of opportunities. You know, there's I'll paraphrase a saying that, you know, don't let any good crisis go to waste. You know, take advantage of it. And we were able to take advantage of it in Louisiana, not only from the state bar standpoint. We were able to get our first dues increase in 25 years, a couple of years after that, you know. That's my successors. I wasn't part of that. But I don't think we could have made that happen had we not provided all these services to our members, which, you know, there's a lesson, you know, in Miramar, the general provides the services. He's now the president. The Bar Association, we provide the services. We had about 17,000, just slightly under 17,000 practicing lawyers in Louisiana when Katrina hit August 29th. Almost 9,000 of them were displaced from either their home or their office for more than 30 days. The Supreme Court declared a legal holiday for 5 months after, so that you couldn't conduct legal business. But as a result, we gave out stipends from these donations we received to over 5% of the practicing lawyers in Louisiana. You know, which you think about that, 5% of your members needed a $500 or a $750 stipend to help make ends meet. You know, so there's a lot of good that came out of what was a very tragic storm that we were ill prepared for. You know, I think we're much better prepared in Louisiana. I think the federal government's has done a much better job of responding to crisis in the states. But it takes a lot of effort, and that's, you know, with the World Justice Forum and the world effort, and having gotten to know David over these past few days, it's just such it's much more of a monumental task worldwide because of the lack of infrastructure and, you know, the populations. And the one thing we haven't talked about, and this is one thing that it made me realize after the storm, the most affected population is not my friends who were out of their offices for 30 days. Yeah, that's tragic and that's a shame, but it's the poor people that couldn't evacuate from New Orleans. They didn't have a car. They didn't have a relative in Dallas they could go to. And, you know, across the world, that's the population that's most affected by disasters. You know, the population that's moved to the urban areas. And that's what I think from a world standpoint we need to plan for. We need to think about how do we serve those people best.
Well, and it would seem that all the processes set up to help them, with some sense of rule of law in those processes, are all relatively complicated for them. So is there somehow that if you were advising a bar in one of those countries, is there some contingency plan they should have about providing legal services in a different way following a disaster? Or?
Well, the ABA has adopted a model rule that over half the states have now adopted about letting lawyers into the state. You know, Louisiana wouldn't let other lawyers come in to practice. The model rule has them appending to a legal service corporation. In a foreign country, I think, you know, our cultures are so different. You know, the Japanese have so fewer lawyers, and the lawyers are less involved in some of the more mundane things that we're involved in the States. So, you know, I think the lawyers can be leaders and help set up these call centers, or you know, in our case, we had these disaster centers that people went to. You know, I think it's a much more difficult problem, as David is probably the better one to respond to the issue worldwide than I.
David?
Yeah, I mean, there are situations that are undeniably complicated. I mean, it costs a lot of money to fix the situation. But there have been, you know, in Colombia and Brazil, for instance, there have been efforts to start to progressively kind of legalize illegal settlements with some money, but also just with some tolerance for, you know, the current situation that's against every other kind of rule, to slowly bring them into the system, start allowing them to have infrastructure, allow them to send their kids to school, for instance. And that's really the way to go. I mean, the governments really just have to kind of bite the bullet and realize that these people are, if they're not yet a huge political issue for them, they will be when there's a big disaster, and they are the ones who are most at risk. And so even though it's going to cost something, they should spend the money. And so what they did in both of these countries is they have a system where they're legalizing their title at the same time where they're starting progressively to create some rules, so that they have building codes and these kinds of things over time, but also providing some subsidies so that they can actually afford to do it. Or, if necessary, moving them, but doing it in such a way that people have a say, that people have a say where they're heading, that it maintains a sense of community. It can be done, but it does require a lot of political will.
Yeah. And one thing I know earlier from conversations with David, he can express incentives in terms of how the politician might think. But at the same time, fundamentally, I think all three are aimed at the humanitarian concern of just helping people, as we heard, with the poor. Now, we have a little time, so let's take some questions. In the back first, microphone up front.
Okay, thanks. I'm Hashmat from Afghanistan. One of the issues in the disaster relief is international assistance, and it needs legal facilities. I'm writing a report on the legal facility of Afghanistan when a disaster happens and the government asks for the international assistance. My question is that it's a big issue like visa process, custom duties, taxes, and also the registration of the organizations, these legal facilities to be provided by the country that's in disaster. So my question is that how the U.S. and the Japan have handled these issues. Do you have any specific law on that provide facilities for international assistance, or how you practice these issues? Because it needs a regulatory framework to attract those assistance. Thank you.
Maybe I'll respond first. Well, back in 1995, there was a major earthquake which hit the city of Kobe. And at that time, the Japanese government did not expect any foreign assistance to come to Japan. And of course, there were a lot of, I would say, frictions happened. And by having learned the lessons from that disaster, it's not a law, but we have something called a National Disaster Management Plan, Basic National Disaster Management Plan. And there is a chapter on acceptance of international assistance. And in that plan, it sets up which ministry should be responsible for which part of accepting the international assistance. And this has functioned in the case of the March 11 earthquake and tsunami in 2011. But we still have had some frictions, but much better than the 1995 case. So we have, we were not expecting any foreign aid in 1995. Now we have realized that there would be more foreign aid coming in. So we have made a mechanism to at least accept it. Yeah. Yeah, yes.
The I4C has passed a model act, and they're, I guess, lobbying to all countries to pass it in their countries. Have Japan attempt to pass that model act?
Well, instead of having the model act, we have incorporated in the basic plan, the national basic plan. But at the same time, I must tell you honestly, as David mentioned, not all the international offers of assistance are useful. And that's the reality. And in case of, also in the case of 1995 Kobe earthquake, and also in the case of the March 11 earthquake and tsunami, what we have recommended through the diplomatic channels is the best way to help us would be cash donations through the International Federation and the Japanese Red Cross, because that's the most useful thing. That's the reality. But not all the countries would accept this idea. because they want to show the flag. The donors, you have to think of the donors' incentives. And I have witnessed this when I was working as a senior relief coordination officer in the UN. Every donor, they want to show their flag. And you cannot stop that. And how to try to modify their wish to show the flag and the real need of the affected area. How to really modify this goodwill into a usable goodwill. That's the biggest challenge for any country, I must say. Yeah.
So Frank, I don't know the situation with the U.S. I would assume it has not.
I don't profess to be an expert on U.S. policy on this, but just from my anecdotal experience after Katrina, it was encouraged for foreign governments to make a donation to the Red Cross or through a foundation, not to the government itself. But I think David was just telling me about part of our new Immigration Act that's up for consideration that has provision in it.
Well, the U.S. also, like Japan, they have a national response framework for disasters, and they added a little provision in there about international assistance, and they created this interagency system of operations that's about receiving assistance from outside governments. And so, at least because during Katrina, there were like over a dozen of these sort of little committees that were started among different agencies to start dealing with this, and they were not very coordinated. So their hope is to coordinate better on that level. And the currently pending immigration bill actually has a provision in there about visas for relief personnel, like Mexico has just passed. But maybe like a government that's gone a lot farther than this is Indonesia. Indonesia had provisions about it in their Disaster Management Act that they passed after the tsunami, and they've adopted detailed regulations and guidelines since then that they've actually already been putting into practice with the West Sumatra earthquake a couple of years ago with success. And one of the things that they've done, for instance, is have like a one-stop shop for stamps. So they have all the different agencies together at the port, and they are authorized to stamp everything they need to stamp for those that come in. And the other thing that they've done, which we think is a really good idea, is that they have made the legal facilities that they're giving dependent on their level of trust in the agency. So it's not based on the nature of the item, not just because it's food that's coming in, but it's because that agency we trust and they'll bring the right kind of food. Because sometimes if you just say, and some governments do this, they'll put out a list to say, okay, we could use food and we could use tents. And then they end up with sort of packaged snacks and camping tents, that are no good for cold weather. And it's better to sort of create the responsibility and on the agency, have a kind of fast lane for them, but then also hold them responsible for having a certain level of quality.
And I would only add, in relation to something you said earlier, David, there's a difference between access and then using it. And so if there's an on-site coordinator, if there's a plan in which there's someone, at least the contingency plans I recall, it would be that person would decide what's used, where it goes, and the order in which it's used. Other questions? Please, up front here.
I'm Lillian from Tanzania, and actually the question I have, whatever you have discussed is actually in relation to tsunami, floods, earthquake, but I haven't heard about drought, which has been a big issue in Africa or in my own country where I come from. And I was wondering if it is part of the international disaster issue, which is discussed especially in the Red Cross, because it's a big issue which is affecting our people. And also to know if there are any legal measures or legal framework in relation to drought that we can see how we can deal with this, because it is a huge problem which is always there for ages and years, and actually the government is not doing anything at all. But also the other thing I was to ask, if climate change, because I can see a lot of movements in my own country engaging, especially the government engaging in climate change, but actually not in drought. So my question is it climate change closer to disaster, oh, disaster, if drought is a disaster, so how is it going to be tackled in my own country, especially in the pastoralist context where I come from? Thank you.
Why don't we take the last two questions? You had a question also? Yes. So can we just pass, and we're just about out of time, so one
Okay, question and observation. It seems to me that what all three of you need is a good PR marketing campaign, because while David is extremely articulate, I'm amazed at the complexity and the problems that still aren't solved in the 21st century, for goodness sakes, with all the technology. I mean, and so it seems to go to politics. And for you, I mean, it's about the press. If the disaster gets in the press, well, there, you know, it gets attention. And so it still goes down to being market driven and needing political cooperation and leadership. You know, Warren Bennis writes a lot about leadership, and he says in his book on becoming a leader, there are three things in the history of civilization that are going to destroy us. One is nuclear destruction, a second is a pandemic, and a third is lack of leadership. And it seems like to me that this loss of leadership, that politicians aren't elected if they talk about the drought, okay, or the tsunami, or that they're prepared for a Katrina. I mean, we watched Katrina unfold, you know, in the media, and you're going, this is a state, where are the people, why isn't the help coming? How ridiculous that in the 21st century we send them to, where, some Texas stadium or something? There's no plan. I mean, I'm listening, I'm amazed, excellent information, but why aren't we educating? Maybe through the World Justice Project, maybe leadership there, so that this attention comes to bear on leadership. That no one's elected to an office unless they can pronounce all of the things they need to about being leadership for a disaster.
Hear, hear. Well, you know, as I was saying at the outset, almost every step we can take, a marginal leader, would improve the situation. So, and I think you have a group here all just agreeing with you. Now, what I'm going to ask is you respond to either question, both questions, and throw in any last comments you have. We've taken everyone to the limit of our time. And we'll go again from Satoru over. Satoru.
Okay. Let me tell you an anecdote. The paradox of disaster risk reduction. The more our disaster managers, especially in prevention, the more we are successful, what happens? Our budget would be cut. It actually happened. In Japan, we have been struggling with typhoons and floods throughout the history of our country. And we have made so many dikes, so many dams, and so many flood control works. 3 years back, there was a political change. The ruling party said, this is ridiculous. No more flood control. Cut the budget. And that happened. And that's the reality. If we are successful in reducing the risk, and if we have less and less casualties, less political attention would be paid. Of course, the media would just omit it. And that's a paradox. And I was wondering if there is a way to overcome this phenomenon. We have been trying to mobilize various, I would say, top leaders, various icons to be concerned about disasters. We have tried our best, but the issue of disaster, it does not necessarily mean profit. It does not make immediate cash, but it's very important. How to overcome this gap is the challenge that I have been thinking for my career in 30 years. Thanks.
Right.
To address both of your questions, or attempt to, you know, the problem is New Orleans, they had not had a major storm since the early 60s, so the collective memory had faded, and so they were ill prepared and became very complacent. You know, I can't tell you how many times hurricanes come to Louisiana, okay, it's another, you know, get a candle, get a flashlight, and it'll all be all right. So there's a complacency factor, and it's just with all the strain now on government budgets, you know, where essential services are being cut, unfortunately, I think disaster preparedness is part of it. It's, you know, it's not going to get the money that it probably deserves. With regard to your issue on the drought, we actually talked about that earlier in our working group. And, you know, I think it goes back to, I think it was David's comment about, you know, a mid-size level flood that is disastrous, but it doesn't get the notoriety of a tsunami. And a drought is, you know, the temporal part of a drought is it takes, you know, months, years, and it's not, you know, the earthquake happened, you know, and all the lights went out, or, you know, the hurricane hit, and you know, you go back to the press, and, you know, I've seen articles on, you know, South Sudan and the drought and the misery there, but it's, you know, it's a condition that for whatever reason it just doesn't seem to get the international attention that it should, and you know, that, I think part of that is the definition of what's a disaster, and that's clearly a crisis and a disaster in your country. I think David's in a much better, you know, my observations are strictly anecdotal as a lawyer who practices in a relatively small town in the United States, but, you know, David can speak from the Red Crescent perspective.
Can I just add to that? Because I think that was very good, Frank. I think an issue with a drought is acute. And I think you do see, if the media hits, you see a respond in Ethiopia, you see a respond in Sudan, response. But it sort of brings you back from the edge of disaster, right? That drought. There's another drought in this vicious cycle that Satoru was responding to. It's coming again. But when you back off from acute, you slip into the whole discussion about development aid generally. And all of a sudden, it's a question of how much solidarity do we really feel generally. And so ongoing aid versus the acute aid. And I think that's sort of built in part into some psychology nations have about what they're going to commit to, or what forum, what discussion they're going to do it in. And it's particularly with drought, I think that's one of the toughest issues, because they are pulled back from just the worst of situations, but they're not left in a good situation either.
Maybe may I add?
Yes.
Well, regarding droughts, it's a slow creeping start. It takes maybe months to really turn into drought. What I have observed when I was working for the UN is that when the drought situation really happens, the international aid is usually food assistance. But the international aid, the food assistance, does not solve the real reason of the drought. Actually, if you really want to control the drought, you have to have water resources management and land use planning. And this is a governance issue. So the international aid for the drought has nothing to do with the real reason for the drought. And there's a big mismatch in this phenomenon. So if you really want to address the issue of drought, at least you have to have local weather forecast, local water resources management, and land use control plans. Then that would solve the problem of the droughts. But the mismatch between the international aid and the causes of the drought, and that's the biggest challenge, I think, for the drought issue. Yeah.
David.
I mean, I think these are very good points. I mean, and just to add on to that, maybe Jessica, with her experience at FAO, can give us more information. I mean, it's also agricultural policy, right? I mean, there's a lot of different elements of policy, of sort of livelihoods, you know, and food security that are involved in this. You're right that it doesn't get the attention that it should. There is a UN convention on combating desertification that has pretty wide ratification, and that goes into quite a lot of detail about things that governments are responsible to do, including involving the community in education and getting feedback from them, and using traditional methods and including them in their planning and in their ways to stop desertification from happening in the first place. But it has not been as successful at kind of hooking into the international limelight or the donor dollars as the HAGUE framework has in the past. some of the kinds of issues that I was talking about before also can be an issue in drought. I mean, we've seen some cases in Africa where big shipments of food were stuck and not being released because of the desire not to admit that there's a need for them, for instance, in customs. But again, I mean, it's not so much usually the problem of too many actors coming at the same time, but not enough. So basically, I agree with Satoru that the real focus is to try to encourage and promote and cajole governments to take the steps that they need to before the drought happens, to make sure that it's not a disaster on people's food security. And just on your point about the political situation, we complain a lot in the international community about political will. There's not enough political will. And you really wonder, like, who is this idiot political will, and why doesn't he get off his seat and do something? What you would like to see is community level demand for this, right? That this would actually have an impact. And some of the studies, political science studies that have been done, show that there is some impact on sort of disaster, perceptions of disaster leadership on subsequent elections. But it's not necessarily direct. So sometimes what some of these studies show is that you will lose the election just if a lot of people are affected by the disaster, regardless whether you did everything you could have afterwards or not. So there's definitely an education issue, there's a PR issue. I completely agree. It can't just be done by the humanitarians. It can't be just left to the lawyers.
Definitely not to lawyers. Let me just say, great last question. What we need are leaders. All of you are leaders. A message that's coming from, I think, all three is any action is a good action in this area. I hope you will all lead, and I hope you will join me in thanking three leaders who are contributing a great deal.